Thank you guys for coming here. Welcome to our speakers series event this afternoon. My name is Austin Rose, and I work with Whatcom County Public Works in the Natural Resources Department as staff for the Whatcom County Marine Resources Committee, which is known as the MRC. The MRC is a partner with the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network, which we call WIN. And WIN is a coalition whose mission is to protect and restore our local waters and watersheds through information sharing, collaboration, education, and public engagement. So the MRC is happy to be co-hosting tonight's event as it features one of the projects that they participate in every summer. Now the MRC is a voluntary panel of citizens, and they are brought together to identify priorities for local marine resources and protection. They are a community advisory group to the Whatcom County government, but they also implement these on-the-ground projects that benefit local marine resources and habitats, and they have these outcomes that then advance more regional conservation goals and restoration goals. So the Whatcom MRC is one of 7 MRCs that function under a congressionally authorized bill that's known as the Northwest Straits Marine Conservation Initiative Act. And this was set up as a structure for local communities to engage in marine resources issues under the support of what's known as the Northwest Straits Commission. And the commission provides coordination, funding, and technical assistance to all 7 MRCs and helps them connect their work to these important regional initiatives. So the project that you're going to learn about tonight is a regional project that all 7 MRCs are participating in. And quickly, I wanted to let you know that there will be time for questions at the end of the presentations. And you can do that in a couple ways. You can raise your hand and verbally ask your question when you're called upon. Just hover over your mouse at the bottom of the screen and press the raise hand icon. Or you can simply type your question in the chat. And there's no need to wait until the speakers are done until you type your question. We will be addressing all those questions that we can at the end of the presentation. So I will pass things off to my colleague Dana, who's going to be introducing the speakers tonight.
Hi everyone, I'm Dana Flerschinger. I'm also staff with Whatcom County Public Works and for the Whatcom County Marine Resources Committee. And today we have 2 speakers with us to discuss the importance of bull kelp and the efforts being done to monitor and protect this marine species in Washington State. So first we'll hear from Jeff Whitty, who is the Kelp Program Manager at the Northwest Straits Commission. In this role, Jeff coordinates the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan, which provides policy and research goals and actions to advance kelp conservation and recovery in the Puget Sound. Jeff also coordinates the Northwest Straits Floating Kelp Monitoring Project, in which MRCs with county-paced volunteers monitor kelp beds via kayak to observe how those beds change over time. Additionally, after Jeff speaks, we'll have Eleanor Hines talking a little bit more about Whatcom County specific efforts. Eleanor Hines currently works as the Executive Director for Twin Harbors Waterkeeper. She has a BS in Environmental Toxicology and an MS in Environmental Toxicology Risk Assessment from the College of the Environment at Western Washington University. She has experience in water quality, citizen science, marine policy, volunteer organization, and citizen engagement, and has worked with the Surfrider Foundation, the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association, the Whatcom County MRC, Friends of Skagit Beaches, the Portage Bay and Drayton Harbor Shellfish Protection District committees, and others locally. Growing up in Philadelphia, the Pacific Northwest was a natural place for Eleanor to settle, with so many places to play outside from the mountains to the ocean. While working remotely from Whatcom County, she works for fishable, drinkable, and swimmable waters for everyone in the outer Washington coast watersheds, with the support of an international network of water protectors. And she has been involved with the kelp monitoring efforts with Whatcom MRC since 2015. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff and Eleanor.
Thank you, Dana. I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. Can you see my screen okay? Excellent, thank you. Well, as Dana mentioned, my name is Jeff Whitty, and I'm the Kelp Program Manager at the Northwest Straits Commission. And Eleanor and I are here to talk to you, as Dana said, about kelp forests, and more specifically, kelp monitoring in Washington and Whatcom County. And as Austin graciously explained, I am from Northwest Straits Commission. The commission does work with 7 MRCs, Marine Resources Committees, the Whatcom MRC being one of the 7. The other 6 are spread across San Juan, Skagit, Snohomish, Island, Jefferson, and Clallam counties. And so you can see that we are quite widely spread out through Northwest Washington. This explains a lot about where we do our kelp monitoring, as you see later on. So why are we here? Basically, we're here to talk about kelp, and more specifically kelp forests, which is pretty exciting. I don't know if you heard, but kelp forests were recently, I think it was in April, announced to be, or bull kelp forests were announced to be Washington State marine kelp forest. And not only that, but Bull Kelp Day is now officially, as prescribed by the governor, is April 16th. So I'm looking forward to celebrating that next year and every year to come. So pretty exciting. But we're here to talk about kelp forests, and a good place to start is to just try to better understand kelp forest in general. And not everybody has the luxury of being able to jump in our waters, go under the surface, and see the enormity of these amazing kelp forests and the life that they provide. So what I want to start out with here is just kind of give you an imaginary walkthrough of a kelp forest, just to get that picture in your head. So the best way to do this really is to start on land and think of the last time you went walking through your favorite forest, whether it was the North Cascades or in the peninsula or just your backyard. And as you're walking through that forest, you see these trees surrounding you, and you follow those big trunks all the way up to the sky, and above you, you see these branches and leaves forming this canopy over the forest. And in that canopy, as you're looking up, the sun's coming down, filtering through the leaves, birds are flying through the branches and leaves. And then you start coming back down, looking down those trunks, you might see some squirrels perching on the trunks, and you come farther down to the forest floor and you see those understory plants, those ferns, those bushes, those small trees. And in those understory plants, you might see like a raccoon or a rabbit hiding there. And if you're really lucky, you might even see a deer running by through the forest. So now take that same image, imagine that underwater. Instead of those tall trees, now you have tall bull kelp or giant kelp growing up to the water surface. And as you follow that up to the surface, you see that the blades coming together near the surface, forming that same type of canopy you saw in the forest on land, with a light filtering down through their blades or their leaves, if you will. And instead of birds, now you're seeing schools of herring swimming above you, or small salmon. And then you come back down those large trunks of that kelp, or the stipes as we call them. And instead of seeing squirrels perching on those trunks or stipes, we now see kelp crabs. And you keep going down to the forest floor, and instead of seeing that understory of plants, now you have 20 species of understory kelp of different shapes and sizes. And inside or below those kelp, you might see a rockfish or a sea star hanging out. And then if you're lucky, instead of seeing a deer, you might have like a harbor seal zip on past you, looking at you with those big black eyes. And if you take that whole imagery and you take a step back and you really focus in on the whole image, you can kind of start to see what the understory or what the kelp forest itself as a whole is. It's this massive ecosystem that supports a ton of life. It provides a lot of services to not only the various other algae and plants and fish, invertebrates and mammals, but to people as well. So this really gets at the importance of kelp forests. They not only provide critical habitat to a lot of important fish that are at least important to us, like rockfish and salmon, providing sanctuary foraging grounds and places to lay eggs, such as herring. But they're also a critical base for the food webs, feeding things like kelp crabs, urchins, abalone, other species that feed on algae, which kelp is, and then other species feed on them, and they work your way up the food web. In addition to that, kelp is important to many local cultures, to human cultures, including many Northwest tribes. And this is just a tip of the iceberg. We're still trying to figure out all the services that the kelp forest does provide, and there are many more that we do know. So these are very important habitats that we need for our Puget Sound ecosystem. Unfortunately, though, bull kelp itself is a type of floating kelp and is declining or has disappeared in parts of Puget Sound, specifically in central and southern Puget Sound. This map here is created by Washington DNR. It's called the Floating Kelp Indicator. You can use this QR code to get there, or there is the website down here below. And what you're looking at is a map created by DNR where they took data or information from Samish Indian Nation, from the MRC's kayak monitoring, and Washington DNR and put it all together. And they created these trends for each of these dots, which are different kelp beds or kelp sites, if you will. And they labeled them as increasing, decreasing, or stable. And by stable, we're talking about over the long term, because kelp beds do vary quite a bit year to year. But over the long term, they're relatively stable without a significant increase or decrease. They then took those individual ratings and created an overall rating for each of these subbasins or these polygons. And what you get is this map. And so the red are areas or subbasins where the kelp, the floating kelp in general, is decreasing. Here in the Straits and on the coast, it's green, meaning that it's stable. Again, not significantly increasing or decreasing over the long term. And in both of these areas, there are exceptions, as you see red dots in this green area and green dots in this red area. But overall, that's the general trends. Then in northern Puget Sound, we've got areas that are blue and yellow, which means that we just don't have enough information really to make that final call to see if they are significantly increasing, decreasing, or stable. It's largely due to a lack of historical information that we just have not input into this data yet, but it's something we need to focus on more. The really cool thing is yellow areas in yellow are areas they were able to increase the information by using traditional ecological knowledge, specifically by Samish Indian Nation here in the San Juans, which shows us that there is a potential concern of decline, as this information showed that there was a lot more kelp in these areas in years past. And this map here does only show floating kelp, which is 2 of the 22 species of kelp in Washington. The 20 other understory, 20 or so species of understory kelp are not shown on this. And that's because we don't really have the information yet. There's been great work done by Reef Check, which is a group that trains volunteer scuba divers to do surveys, PSRF or Puget Sound Restoration Fund, Samish Indian Nation, Seattle Aquarium, and others that are starting to monitor this understory kelp. So hopefully in a year or a couple of years, we'll have that information and a map similar to this. So why is kelp disappearing? Why is it not doing well? There are a number of potential factors. A lot of the researchers are still trying to figure this out, but there's factors that negatively impact kelp, which we call stressors. Some of the top culprits that are very likely causing the declines in kelp are things like temperature. Bull kelp, for instance, does not like temperatures above 16 degrees, and they really don't do well with temperatures above 18 degrees. And when you have long periods of this, such as in 2014 to 2016, when we had that heat wave, heat blob come through, that really impacts kelp. Another one is shade. Kelp is not a plant. They are an algae, but like plants, they do photosynthesize and they need light. When you put up a dock and create shade, that can restrict light from understory kelp especially, or when you have erosion or increased sediment transport into the water, and so you get increased suspended sediment, that sediment can also decrease the light and decrease the growth of kelp. Bottom type, the substrate. If you've ever seen a kelp, it's like a bull kelp especially, wash on shore, on one end of it looks like a root-like structure. These aren't roots. These are actually called holdfasts, and they're used to grab onto and secure the kelp to a rocky bottom. When you do get that increased sediment wash into the ocean or into Puget Sound, and it buries this hard substrate, you then decrease the habitat availability where kelp can grow. Grazers, we're fairly lucky in Puget Sound where we actually don't have the big grazing problem that the coast has with urchins, especially California. But we do have other grazers. We do have some urchins, but we have other grazers like kelp crab that also will feed upon kelp. But that is not to put a hit list on kelp crabs. Kelp crabs are natural. They're supposed to be there. They're part of the ecosystem. So that's important to recognize. Physical damage is another one. You want to make sure to avoid taking your boat and its propeller into the kelp forest, because this can cause a lot of damage to the kelp, especially the floating kelp that's at the surface. And then obviously there's another one, which is water quality. We still have a lot of work to go, but has been a lot of research in the last year or two on kelp stressors to find out what is going on, what stressors are out there and how they're affecting kelp. But really now is a time that Washington as a community needs to come together to better understand kelp and how to conserve and recover it, excuse me. And we took a great step forward in 2020 when the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation Recovery Plan, or the KELP Plan, was published. So this is available again as QR code or this link. It's also on the Northwest Straits Commission page. This has not only is a call to action for everybody to move forward into preserving kelp, but also provides 6 goals and 65 actions, which largely focus on research and policy to advance kelp conservation and recovery. And within the 6 goals, within the plan, these 6 goals focus on understanding and reducing kelp stressors, understanding ecosystem values, describing distribution trends of kelp, designating protected areas of kelp, restoring kelp forests, and improving awareness and action. And as I mentioned, a lot of these actions are focused on policy and research. And so you might think policymakers and researchers are the main audience of this plan, but this plan was made for everybody. It was a very large coordinated effort, took 40+ partners over 2 to 3 years to make this. And a lot of these actions, the general public can also undertake. So it's really, it's a thrilling read. It's actually very informative. And if you want to go through it and look through the actions to see which ones that you can participate in, there are quite a few of them. And especially one thing you can focus on is monitoring. Monitoring is simply put the observing or observing of kelp and or kelp beds over time and space. And it is essential throughout the kelp plan. Not only is it needed to identify where kelp is, but also how it's doing. And so there are efforts, as I'll describe in a second, like the MRC, the Whatcom MRC and other MRCs that are going out to monitor kelp via kayak. And there's also Reef Check, which, like the MRCs, take volunteers out to monitor these beds through surveys, but Reef Check trains scuba divers to go out and do scuba surveys. So there's 2 opportunities right there that anybody that is interested in these opportunities can partake in simply by asking if they can be involved. So kelp monitoring is kind of where we're going to focus the rest of the talk on. Again, it's very important, not only because it's used in the beginning to understand where kelp is, but then again, it's also used to better understand how stressors affect kelp and how restoration efforts, which come later in, are doing. And so it's needed indefinitely throughout the conservation plan. This monitoring is not new, as many Northwest tribes have been observing kelp for many generations. But kelp monitoring can take on many different forms depending upon the reason for the monitoring. And depending upon the questions you ask will depend upon what you monitor. So what are the different types of factors that you are going to monitor for? So one is bed area or density. And so like the MRCs, they will go out to monitor beds using kayaks, and they'll take a GPS unit on their kayaks and do a perimeter across the bed pretty much once every month in the summertime. And they do that year after year after year to see how the beds grow and or shrink, to determine that basically the health of the beds and get a better idea of how stressors, things like temperature, might be affecting those beds. Another thing you can look at is kelp condition, reproductive state, or water quality, to look at the effects of stressors on kelp. And then you can also look at who is living in the kelp forests and what are they doing to understand how those kelp forests are being used by those different critters. This, for one instance, this is one of those kelp crabs I was talking to you about, covered with many, many barnacles. So also determining upon the question you're asking will determine upon how you monitor that kelp. And so there are a number of ways a number of organizations and groups are taking on kelp monitoring. 3 of these being air-based, such as satellite, fixed wing aerial, so a plane, or drone monitoring. All three of these are being done by Washington DNR, mostly fixed wing, aerial, and drone. And then Samish has also been working on analyzing a lot of the aerial monitoring as well. And a lot of this aerial data, as you can imagine, is looking down on the kelp. So it's really good at looking at things like density of floating kelp and or the area and how that changes over time. Then as you come down to the surface of the water and you get into a boat, such as a kayak, there are a lot of groups doing this, such as, again, 6 MRCs, a number of tribes, Vashon Nature Center, DNR, that we're all going out on our kayaks and surveying these kelp beds to look at not only the perimeters year after year and seeing how those change, but when you're on that surface level, then you get a closer look at that kelp and you can look at kelp condition, how it's doing year after year, as well as what's occupying that kelp in at the surface. Then you get other groups such as UW, Reef Check, Puget Sound Restoration Fund, Seattle Aquarium, Samish, and other groups that are using scuba, snorkel, or remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, to look under the surface and see, again, how critters are using these areas from top to bottom, but also how that understory kelp, that lower kelp, is doing, where it exists in the trends. So as you can see, there's quite a few options of how things are being monitored. And we do have quite a few, I think maybe like 10, 15 sites where a lot of these projects are being co-located. So we have researchers underneath the water looking at understory kelp and how salmon occupy these areas. We have MRCs at the surface monitoring them, these kelp beds. And then we also have DNR flying overhead, all in the same beds, so we can really make a comprehensive story of what's happening on specific kelp beds. And so, as I've kept mentioning, the MRCs do have a kelp kayak monitoring program. And to give you a little better overview of what this is, I'm going to play you a really quick, I think it's about 3-minute video of provides an overview of this program. So here you go. Hopefully it's sound comes through. You might have to turn up a little bit. We might have an audio problem. Can people hear this?
No.
Yeah, sorry. Well, you can watch the visual. I'm trying to work on the sound while it goes. Oops. Okay. Well, what I'm going to do, see if I can do this. I'm going to put this in the chat so you all can watch it at your leisure. I apologize for the technical issues. There you go. You can use that link to watch the video. But for now, I'll go ahead and continue on with my presentation. Okay, so the big picture of what that video is about is that the MRCs, each of the MRCs in the North Puget Sound repeatedly monitor select kelp beds to create reliably long-term data sets through community science and track trends in floating kelp. And it's exactly this that myself and Eleanor will be going through in a bit more detail. So this program started in 2014 when an island MRC member asked what is happening with the bulk kelp in our area, because at that time there was not much monitoring going on, especially in the northern Puget Sound. And so in 2014, the Northwest Straits Commission came along and said, oh, let's develop a program where the MRCs themselves can collect their data to answer these questions. And by 2015, we had 4 MRCs to run the pilot project. And last year, we had 6 MRCs with 53 volunteers go out to pretty much the sites you see here in red. And as I mentioned earlier, the MRCs are spread out quite a bit through the northwest area of Washington, so you understand basically why you're seeing the red dots where they are, each located in the respective counties of each MRC. So as mentioned, the MRCs do go out about 1 to 4 times each summer between June and September, and they go out to about 20 plus sites each year. I think last year we got to 23. Sometimes weather does not allow us to go out. And yeah, so we go out and collect this data, and we do this following a protocol. And the protocol was written by Emily Bishop in 2014, and it's there really so that we can not only compare sites between time, but also between MRCs. So we make sure that the MRCs are doing this, using the same methods to make this possible. And an example of something from this protocol is that we ask the volunteers to go out in good weather, so no wind, low to no rain, at about a 0 to -1 tide and during slack tide when kelp is most visible. And the most important thing is we ask them to be consistent and go out at the exact same time each time. And that way, what they're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, because if you go out at different tides, then you're going to see various sizes of kelp beds based on what is visible and what is not. And so then we ask them to paddle around their designated kelp beds while they create a track with a GPS unit and measure things like temperature and depth at key points, and also make observations of critters that they might see in the water amongst all the kelp. And this is available on the kelp plan, or excuse me, the Northwest Straits Commission Kelp Program Monitoring Program website, available at this link. And not only do we provide a protocol for the MRCs to follow, we also give them annual training. We just went through our annual kayak kickoff, which is, I always like it. It's a fun time. But where we refresh the MRC's minds with how to use the protocol, what's in the protocol, how to use GPS, how to take data, and then also we train them with safety. And just to show you how much effort goes into all this, and between 2015, when we had our pilot study, all the way to 2024 last year, so that's about 10 to 11 years per site, we had volunteers, again, volunteers, go out and paddle to over 2,400 miles, which is the same distance as going from Seattle to Puerto Vallarta, which is a massive difference. But if you are more into exercise and you like to count your calories, this is roughly equal to 542,816 calories, which is so much. Or if you prefer your food, it's roughly equivalent to 2,727 donuts, which is a lot of donuts. So as you can see, this is a major undertaking by so many volunteers, and we are so appreciative of all the volunteers that put this work in. And because they're putting so much work in, a lot of great data is coming out of this. And primarily the data is used and meant for the MRCs, which Eleanor will get into a little bit later, but is also used by a number of our partners. Northwest Straits Commission, well, first of all, the MRCs will take their data and send it to Northwest Straits Commission. We will then process it and then put it up on a thing called Sound IQ. And once you get there, it looks like this map, where you get the different kelp beds here. Each of these lines are a different survey. You can access it with this QR code or the site address here. But any survey that the MRCs have done are located in Sound IQ. And so a number of research grad students have used this and have said, thank you, this has been amazing. We used it in our research studies. So it's being used in that way by anybody in the public, but also we do specifically hand this out to some of our partners, such as Washington DNR and University of Washington, who are using it for things like the floating kelp indicator, which I showed you before. It's also used this last year for things like presence and absence of kelp, in a map that will be coming out very shortly by Washington DNR, and also used by UW for their work to see how things like salmon and forage fish are using kelp throughout Puget Sound. So as you can see, a lot of this effort is being put to good use and being used widely across the state. And with that, I'm going to actually hand things over to Eleanor, and she's going to discuss more of what Whatcom MRC is doing.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. I just posted a long thing in the chat with a bunch of resources for anybody who's interested in some of those things. I think most or pretty much everything Jeff mentioned at some point in time. And so on this slide here, we have a couple of the spots that are Whatcom MRC surveys. Unfortunately, we were not able to get out to Point Whitehorn in 2024. The weather just didn't allow for it. For anybody who hasn't been there, it's a very interesting site because it can be completely and totally calm, but due to its location, you can also have swell so big that I've been out there before where it's glassy calm, no wind, but the swell is so big that you can't see the person, not too far away from you, over the waves. So we try to be very careful about when we do and don't go out there so that we aren't putting anybody into unsafe conditions. There's also a lot of rocks too at low tide to watch out for. So, but they're all fun and nice to go to when we get out to them. And there's a list of the folks. I think that's all the folks that helped out in 2024. And I recognize a lot of the names on this Zoom. So thanks for joining. And next slide. So this slide is just a general overview, just so you can look at it all together. I'm going to dive a little bit more into each of these individual spots. I'll also note too that the Whatcom MRC has also surveyed the Alden Bank, which is 5 miles off of Cherry Point, but also like 5 miles from Susha and Mesha Islands, and so it's kind of out there in the middle of nowhere. So it's a super interesting site, but really hard to get to, really hard to kayak to, and all of that. So I think we've explored some alternative ways of surveying some of those things. And one of the beauties of this project is that so the Northwest Straits Commission provides this backbone of how we should survey, and some of the MRCs have come up with other suggestions or implementations of different things that other MRCs have implemented over the years to kind of add to the baseline of data. And so it's kind of a choose your own adventure kind of ordeal, and you get to choose where you want to survey. I remember when we started surveying in 2015, we kept on asking, so how do you want us to pick our sites? And it was like, where do you want us to pick your sites? Like, that's up to you. And so we figured it out from there, and it's been really great seeing this go from just a community science thing to seeing the creation of the kelp conservation and recovery plan at the state level, as well as it being incorporated as a Puget Sound vital sign. I feel like these things should have been long ago done, but here we are in 2025, and I'm glad that they're in place now. And so with that, I would also add too that when we started doing these surveys in 2015, we only started with one site because we weren't sure where the kelp was in Whatcom County, and all we really had to go off of was our own knowledge as well as maps from like 1912. And so this might have been a little bit outdated. So it's been an adventure kind of finding these different sites and getting to know them more. And so as you might have noted on one of Jeff's earlier slides where he showed the regional map, I guess, good news, but maybe not great news, is that we aren't seeing a decline in our kelp beds, but we're also not seeing necessarily an increase in our kelp beds. And so as we continue to monitor these beds, it'll be really interesting to kind of see where all that goes. So next slide. So there's a couple different ways that we can monitor these sites. And so over time, we used to just take the perimeter of the whole bed, and each year we would go back to the same site. And then over time we realized, hey, we could continue on because it seems like these two separate beds are now maybe one bed, and how do we account for that when we're just connecting two beds and we weren't serving the second bed. And so we ended up with these things called shoreline segments. And so on the I think it's right-hand side, where the data only goes to 2022, and you can see like the background's gray. That's where the shoreline segment has been cut off. And so what has been decided, especially for the Puget Vital Signs, is we're just looking at this between this point and this point. How is the bed changing over the years? However, at some beds, so the Eastern Preserve is over on Lummi Island. It's just a bit south of where the ferry takes you over. The Lummi Island Heritage Trust has some property over there that they have been restoring over time after the quarry. They've done a great job. There's some trails and lovely public access over there. And so there were these overwater structures and some other things going on there. And so the Lummi Island Heritage Trust was interested in knowing what was happening with this tiny little kelp bed that was happening there. And so I would say that while our trends show no increase, it is kind of getting longer over time. And so I just want to say that there's different ways that you can look at these things. And just it makes sense to look at these beds differently for different beds and for different questions that you're asking. And so it can get a little bit complex if you really dive into the data. But I think that the site has been really neat to see where it has been extending longer and longer, and it looks like it's been getting healthier. And I think it was last year, the year before, there were a bunch of, I can't remember who was out there, but we saw a bunch of sea otters, or not sea otters, sorry, river otters playing around, and it's been looking healthier and healthier over time. Next slide. So in the photo there, you can see there used to be overwater structures and quite a bit going along on the shoreline. And so the kelp bed has been getting denser and longer and healthier over time. But there's not a significant trend, so we count it as no trend, unfortunately. But that's been kind of a really cool sight to see over the years and how it changes. And I appreciate all the work that the Lummi Island Heritage Trust has done to make improvements at that site to make it more ecologically functional. Next slide. So another way that I personally like to look at the data is when you only have 2 years or so of the perimeter outlines, it's nice to look at it on a map together, but sometimes when you're looking at a bunch of years together, it gets, I don't know, my brain starts to scramble. And so I like this presentation of the data where you can kind of like see how it's been growing or shrinking over the years. So the dotted line is the shoreline segment. And then you have by the year, and then you also have how many acres is incorporated in that perimeter. And so you can kind of see how it's been changing over the years with more of a visual geospatial like representation here. Next slide. I think we're on to Gulf Road. So again, all our sites have no trends. So Cynthia asked, Easton getting healthier over time via Let Me Trust. Oh, and so yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, there was a quarry over there, the mining stopped. And so the Lummi Island Heritage Trust ended up with that piece of property. And so they've done some plantings, they removed the overwater structures, like I mentioned. And as there's not shoreline, yeah, so there's not the shoreline activity that there used to be as well. There's not big barges driving up. And so I would attribute all of those activities, the restoration that Lummi Island Heritage Trust has been doing to seeing healthier kelp beds out there. So Gulf Road is up at Cherry Point. It's where the end of Gulf Road kind of meets the water. And so again, it kind of made sense to make shoreline segments here. The north end is at the derelict conveyor. On the other side, you can kind of see a little bit more where this area is. On the south end, there seems to be this like natural break where I would suspect that the substrate has something to do with that, because every year we start our survey at the same spot, and there's always a clear delineation between this bed and there is typically a bed just south of there. And then some years there's some good, healthy, strong beds going north of our survey. area, and then other years there aren't. And so this is one of those tricky ones where, like, if we were to continue, I think continuing south would be kind of a significant indicator of whether or not the kelp bed was expanding, because like I said, there's always a clear like break. But at the north end, you know, some years we'd be paddling like all the way up to Point Whitehorn potentially. And then other years we wouldn't. And it's not necessarily representing how big the full extent of the kelp is in that area if we stop, just because our protocol says to within a certain distance, if there's no bulbs, then you don't include that in that one bed. And so shoreline segments have been helpful at this site for that reason. And this site has also been neat and fun and interesting to see because there's so much going on there. One year, we got out a little bit early to the start of the site, and there were some harbor porpoises swimming around. It seemed like they were feeding on the forage fish that we were seeing all throughout the kelp bed. And lots of other stuff. Sometimes we see great blue herons standing on top of the kelp fishing. And it seems like in the areas where there isn't kelp, there's lots of other things happening, like eelgrass, for example. So it's nice to see where there isn't the kelp bed, there's an eelgrass bed, and lots of other kind of fun, interesting things going on out there. Next slide. So this site kind of goes up and down over the years, like they all do. And so I think, you know, something that is kind of interesting is like looking at kelp beds. Sorry, I didn't include it in this presentation, but potentially looking at the kelp beds and seeing like, are they all doing really well in 2019, or are they not doing well in 2019? Or is it just this one bed that didn't do well in 2019, and why might that be? It's definitely been interesting talking to other MRCs where there are some years where everyone is like, wow, the kelp hit really early and it was really big and really healthy. And then other years where not so much. And there's potentially a number of factors that play into that, such as temperature, or maybe it was a good season for those who like to eat the kelp or something like that. But yeah, or it could have just been the currents or the substrate. The Cherry Point is a hugely dynamic environment, and so the substrate constantly changes, and so I always wonder how much of a role that really plays in the size of the kelp bed and where the kelp settles to start growing. And so again, there is no change. This bed takes so long to survey that sometimes we watch, like as Jeff was saying, you want to make sure that you survey the bed at the same time each time. But it's hard, it's challenging with this bed because you start at one end and it takes you like an hour to get to the other end because there's so much detail to get around. And you know, what was not there in the beginning is suddenly appears, and suddenly the bed is twice the size that it was when you end the survey than when you began it. And so we're kind of brainstorming different ways that we can maybe deal with that better. But one thing that we do try to do is always start from the same side and always circle around in the same direction from the same tide, roughly, so that we try to keep that as consistent as we can. Next slide. So this is one of the few sites that we actually survey more than once. It's amazing how much effort it takes to just get out there, and the wind and the weather kind of can foil your plans really easily, especially at Cherry Point. Like I was mentioning, Point Whitehorn can get really tricky. Gulf Road is pretty similar. Gulf Road is really nice though, because we just drive up to the beach and you can see what the conditions are doing right then and there. And it's a great one for volunteers who haven't volunteered with other ones before, aren't quite sure. It's easier to duck out early if you need to. Not that I encourage that, but we've had a few people who have doctor's appointments or things like that. And so the site is, I would say, one of the more accessible ones, in addition to Easton, which the accessibility issue, I think, at that one is more just the ferry, catching the ferry to and from, which kind of takes a while sometimes. So you can see August and September, it typically tends to be a little bit larger in September, but not necessarily always And we also try to sample within a week or so of when we sampled previously, so that we're not sampling in the beginning of August and comparing that to sampling at the end of August. Do we have a question? Okay, so yeah, next slide. Southwest Lemmy Island, this is the first site that we started sampling in 2015. And you can see relatively where it is with that red line on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, I have the shoreline segment area through 2022 for the vital signs, and then down below that is the Sound IQ mapping, where you can see all of the squigglies together. And this one I feel like has been growing a little bit further towards the north end, which is not captured in that shoreline segment, but so we try to be consistent and note down what we're doing each year, whether we stop before the kelp bed ends, whether we feel like we did the full extent of the kelp bed, and there's different kind of ways we do that with GPS points and our notes and things like that. And so this is a long skinny bed that's super close to shore, and sometimes it gets kind of interesting when you're surveying the shore side, because if it's wavy at all, you're just trying to navigate not landing your boat on the rocks in the shore while you're doing it. But you do the best you can, and there is some error built in where we recognize the GPS unit is only so accurate, and we can only get so accurate with our paddling and maneuvering abilities. But also with that said too, I believe the GPS trackers take something like I think it's like one point every 3 seconds or so. And so we encourage our paddlers to go on the slower side so that we can get more points. Because if you paddle really fast, then you get more of a, you get less detail in your perimeter. Next slide. So again, no trend at the site either, but you can see it kind of like similar to some of the other ones. It's got its ups and its downs. Oftentimes we sample this around mid-August, and there's last several years there's been a salmon derby going on at the same time, so the fishermen are out while we're all out there doing our surveys, and we wave to each other. They seem like they have pretty good luck. It's a neat bed, and it's been interesting watching between we usually camp at the DNR campground on the other side of the island, and it's been interesting over the years. When we first did the survey, there was like one bed that was at Carter Point, I think at the south end of Lemmy Island, that was there that we just kind of did a practice on, and I haven't seen that bed ever since then, and there are lots of other beds that have kind of popped up since then. And so it's interesting to kind of see the changes and think about ways that we might be able to capture that potential growth or shrinkage over time. Next slide. Again, that other visual representation of what's been happening with the bed over the years. 2024, it seemed like it was really extending to the north and the south, more so than it had in the past, which is always nice to see. And I always kind of wonder too with these skinny beds, when you do a shoreline segment, how far out it's really able to go. Because there's factors on how deep they can go or they can grow. I know with eelgrass beds, eelgrass will grow to their eelgrass beds are more limited by light and how deep they can grow in more urbanized areas, and I assume kelp is pretty similar then, because there's just not as much light with turbidity and other factors that play a role in that. Next slide. So Point Whitehorn, this is the one that I was saying was and I think there were two things on here. Anyway, so Point Whitehorn is kind of this interesting one that isn't just like a skinny line along our shoreline. And so we kind of have this box for our shoreline segment. And so it takes a while to paddle out there. Unfortunately, we have to leave at low tide from Birch Bay State Park and return at low tide at Birch Bay State Park, which usually means quite a trek over some sand flats at the end there. But it's a beautiful, gorgeous site. Sometimes we see sea lions out there. You do have to watch out for rocks, like I said. And this is a site that reminds me too that I always like to have conversations with volunteers ahead of time on what kind of boat they're using, because I've had people come out here with boats that they didn't quite feel comfortable taking temperature and depth measurements from because their boat was just a little too responsive for the waves that were going on out there. But we do try to welcome people. We just want to make sure that we're being safe and everybody's comfortable too. So this has been a fun site over the years, like I said, kind of seeing it grow and expand a little bit, but no significant overall trend. I don't know if you can see the very light blue, sort of like butterfly shape at the very bottom of all of those lines. That was the first year that it was done, I think in like 2016 or something like that. And so it's really sort of changed over the years, and the shapes can kind of be similar and kind of different over time. So it's fun to do. Next slide. So as you can see, it's kind of all over the place with the slide going up and down, but kind of somewhat stable between 2021 and 2023 there. But like I said, it's usually pretty out there, and it's a great spot to go if you've never been. Next slide. So the data is used in a lot of different ways, different MRC projects. There's, I mean, it's on Sound IQ, it's used for Puget Sound vital signs. It has helped inform the Washington State Conservation or Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan. I put in a photo here of the Easton Preserve. You can see those overwater structures that are no longer there, and the quarry in the background there. And so in this case, it's kind of fun and interesting to see how the restoration is impacting the kelp bed that's right there. And it can help inform local decisions and planning and other things like that, and as well as help educating communities. And so one of the things that I really love about doing this kind of sampling is that we get the community out there and involved, and then you guys can help insist on things like protecting over I can't remember the numbers on it, but a bunch of eelgrass meadows and kelp forests. There's a piece of legislation passed to up our protection of those, and I think a large part of that had to do with just public interest in those things and recognizing, hey, these are really important. They provide nurseries, and one thing that I love, I heard somebody say about kelp beds is that they're biogenic habitats. So they're living habitats. They're not just, like structures. They're, they provide structure, but they're also living too at the same time. So next slide. And there are several ways you can get involved. You can be part of the monitoring if you want. I think on the next slide, you'll see Dana's contact information as well as Jeff's, and you can reach out to them and learn more about how you can get involved. We typically survey end of July through early September is kind of the season. Be responsible, so that blue box with the kelp figures down there, that is about how to responsibly harvest kelp. It is harvestable, and there are ways to do it without killing all the kelp and be more responsible. You can support, learn, educate, and volunteer. Those are all great ways to get involved. And with that, we'll go to the last slide. And I don't remember if anybody had any closing comments, but we can open it up to questions. And again, here is Dana, Austin's, and Jeff's contact information so that you can reach out to any of them and get involved. I definitely recommend, if you have a kayak, get involved with one of these surveys. They're a lot of fun and make you really appreciate kelp too. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Eleanor and Jeff. That was awesome. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but does anyone want to verbally ask a question?
Sure, I have a question.
Sure.
This is a tool, Vishmani. I'm just curious about the different practices that we have about recreation. Of course, you take kayaks out to do the surveys, but what are practices that people may unwittingly have with either their private recreational craft, sailboats and the like, or other recreational activities that you might unintentionally negatively impact the kelp forest.
Yeah, I guess I can speak. Primarily what I'd be careful of is, interacting with the kelp beds with your motorized vehicles. Try basically avoid the kelp beds, especially the floating kelp beds, so you do not damage them mechanically.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of motorboats don't like being in the kelp beds because it just gets tangled up in their stuff, and whether they have a jet boat or a propeller boat, it just doesn't mix well. And so thankfully that's kind of a that's helpful. At the Cherry Point Gulf Road site, there is sort of an informal boat launch there. And one thing that we have noticed out there is that the prop wash, so as the boats are like going up onto the trailers to launch out, they leave these kind of like divots. And so that kind of wrecks the eelgrass beds and kelp beds out there, or their ability to at least grow in those areas. But yeah, it's always good to be mindful. Also, when you're anchoring too, probably not a good idea to anchor in the middle of the kelp bed. I know the Northwest Straits has a big campaign about eelgrass beds and that, but and I think it's less so for kelp, but I'm sure it could be as well.
So there's someone in the chat who is interested about the ethical harvesting guidelines. I know people eat the stipes. Are there areas you think it's responsible to harvest more than just the blades? Or rules for ethically harvesting the stipes?
I am fortunately and kind of limited in my harvesting knowledge,
Me as well.
which is unfortunate because I just saw somebody who presented on it and that question didn't come up. There you go.
Thank you,
That's a good
Jeff.
link.
Yes, DNR has got a great site, which is where that blue infographic came from on seaweed harvesting. They give you recommendations on basically what is the best practices. There is a scientific paper, I think one in Puget Sound, that did look at this to some degree. But yeah, again, I am also not a aquaculture or harvesting expert, so that's the best I could get for you.
And I think Jennifer Hahn just came out with a Pacific Northwest foraging book, and she kind of goes into some of those best harvesting practices and what to be mindful of as well.
Great question, though.
Okay. Any other questions? We did record this presentation, so it will be available on the WIN website under speaker series, probably within a couple weeks. And we will be following up via email with an evaluation that we would greatly appreciate it if you would fill it out, just to give us a sense of what kind of topics are of interest to people and where we could go with this speaker series. So we'd appreciate you taking a few seconds to fill that out. And like I said, there will be an email sent out probably tomorrow as a follow-up. So, all right. Well, with that, thank you again, Jeff and Eleanor. That was awesome. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.